appreciate that last week's episode, Fight or Flight, wasn't exactly for the faint-hearted. So, if you made it through that one, you'll be pleased to know we're bringing the humour back this week. We've combined a couple of shorter stories that were kindly sent in by listeners into one episode that's guaranteed to remind you that, despite all the professionalism and training that goes into the job, sometimes flying produces moments that are simply too bizarre not to laugh at. So, settle in and enjoy a couple of tales from 35,000 feet that prove the skies can be just as hilarious as they are unpredictable. Doors to armed and cross-check.
Come fly the red eye. Whoa.
Welcome aboard the Red Eye. London to Shanghai, 2001. You'll be fine, babe. Kristin looked at him and forced a smile. It didn't matter how many times people told her she'd be fine. She wouldn't believe it until she actually was. And right now, she was staring down half a day working in a cabin she wasn't familiar with, delivering a service she hadn't been trained for. And as for the seats, well, even the senior crew hated them. So how on earth was she supposed to help passengers when they inevitably asked how they worked? Because they would. Apparently they always did. Word was the airline had really dropped the ball on this one. Yep, some bright spark in head office had signed off on a new business class seat that belonged in a Formula One car rather than an aircraft. Upright, they looked futuristic enough. But once you started sliding towards the floor, eventually ending up at a strange angle that was neither sitting nor lying flat, well, it just didn't work. Yet aircraft after aircraft kept being fitted with them, and the crew were left to apologise, explain and smile through it. But Kristin shouldn't have to. She'd only been flying for a year. She was an economy girl who hadn't yet completed her business class training, and today she was being sent up front as though she'd won a prize. But she didn't want the prize. She wanted an economy trolley, a 4-point service flow, and seats that passengers could operate without needing an engineering degree. But today, as the most senior of the junior crew on board, that choice wasn't hers to make. Suck it up, Buttercup, she told herself as she followed the others down the jet bridge, turning reluctantly left as she boarded. She sighed as she cast her eyes over the cabin she'd be working in, whether she liked it or not, and then gave a small shrug of weary acceptance. All she could do was her best. And if that wasn't good enough, well, that wasn't on her shoulders. And it was proving to be every bit the disaster she'd expected. She'd spilt a drink over a passenger during the very first service, muddled up her meal orders and sent the galley boy into a full-blown meltdown after miscounting the starters. He'd ended up dividing soups meant for one passenger into 2 bowls and plucking prawns off skewers to stretch them into extra portions. Now, though, she froze. Her mouth went dry as she realised she was about to break him. Gary, I'm really sorry, but... He turned from the galley side where he was plating up a chow mein, and she saw him stiffen. He didn't say a word. His jaw tightened, and a small, painfully strained smile settled on his face. He simply raised his eyebrows, waiting. She held out the untouched chicken dinner. Apparently, 1A ordered the pasta. I don't know how it happened. I'm sure he said chicken, or I never would have written it down. Gary took the plate from her and quietly set it on the worktop. Still without a word. Across the galley, Teresa closed her eyes for a moment. Only minutes earlier, she'd had to tell one of her passengers there was no chicken left, much to his annoyance. Stress that, it now seemed, nobody had actually needed. Kristin backed quietly into the aisle. Someone was waiting for a glass of wine anyway, and right now she had the distinct feeling her presence in the galley wasn't helping anyone. At the bar, a couple sat picking at their dinner, deep in animated conversation. They weren't actually a couple. She was at least 10 years older than him, and Kristin was fairly sure they hadn't known each other before the flight. But from the looks of things, they'd hit it off rather well. Could we get 2 more glasses of your French red while you're there? The man asked. Kristin smiled. Of course. Finally, one thing she couldn't possibly mess up. She scanned the bottles until she found the Côte de Rhône. Wine, at least, she understood. She drank it, appreciated it, and right now she dearly loved to drink a glass of it herself. She reached for a clean wine glass at the exact moment Gary appeared around the corner, making her jump. The glass slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor and exploding into 1,000 glittering shards. For a brief second, she and Gary simply stared at each other. I'll get the dustpan and brush, he said eventually, his voice heavy with exhausted resignation. You survived. That's all that matters. Kristin's shoulders shook as she struggled to control her giggles. Only just, she said. Gary wiped a tear from the corner of his eye. It was dark in the cabin, and as they'd sat reliving the last 3 hours of the flight over a cup of tea and a chocolate digestive on the L1 jump seats, Kristin and Gary had discovered they actually got on quite well. In fact, they didn't just get on, they got each other. They had the same sense of humour, and once Gary had felt comfortable enough to share his true appraisal of her performance in business class, Kristin had been far too amused to be offended. But, babe, he said, trying and failing to be serious, I'm not sure you're quite ready for promotion yet. No offence. Oh, none taken, I promise, Kristin laughed. She had no desire to be promoted ever after that disaster. And then, even when the dinner service was finished, the whole performance of putting grown men to bed because they couldn't work out how to do it themselves, well, it just wasn't for her at all. I'm just going to go and do a quick walk around. Make sure everyone's still alive, Gary said, the jump seat snapping up with a thud behind him as he stood. It was dark in the cabin. Half of the crew had gone off on rest, and all that was required of them now was a quick walk around every half an hour. And yet, somehow in the hilarity, almost an hour had passed. At the bar, the 2 passengers were still in cahoots, heads down, sharing a joke in hushed voices. In front of them, a champagne bottle stood empty, when it had been half full the last time he passed. It was obvious they'd been helping themselves to the booze, and it was obvious too that they had drunk too much. 2 gin and tonics, please, sir, the man said. His carefully styled hair had collapsed into his eyes. And make them doubles, he slurred. Gary smiled politely before looking across at the woman. She smiled back, but her eyes were struggling to stay focused. His gaze drifted to the wedding ring on her left hand. Gary had seen this before. 2 strangers meet on a plane, drink too much and lose their inhibitions. The next thing, they're joining the Mile High Club and walking off the next morning, heads down, dignity gone, and carrying nothing but a suitcase full of regret. No, he'd seen it too many times, and these 2 were definitely going to regret it in the morning if he didn't step in before things went too far. Oh, I'm ever so sorry. I'm going to have to close the bar down for a bit while I count the stock for customs, he apologised. It was only half a lie. He did need to count the stock, but not until they were nearly landed. Come back in an hour, he added with a smile, and I'll sort you both out then. The pair looked disappointed for a moment, but didn't argue. Their glasses were empty, and as Gary made a show of locking away the bottles, they took the hint and drifted back to their seats. He watched the woman wobble her way to 2A, while the gentleman all but collapsed into his bed in 6D. It was another thing about the ridiculous seat design, he thought to himself, how the passengers were so low in the bed that they were practically sleeping on the floor. And getting in and out was a challenge for them at the best of times, let alone after a skinful. Still, now they were both down, he doubted he'd see either of them again before breakfast. Kristen was alone in the galley when she heard the noise. Gary had disappeared into the flight deck for a few minutes, and she was just making herself a herbal tea before heading off for her break. 3 blissful hours in a tiny bunk with a rock-hard mattress somehow felt like she was checking into a 5-star hotel. Apart from the constant drone of the engines, that background hum you only noticed when something interrupted it, until then, the cabin had been silent. It wasn't a cry for help, as such, and yet she knew that was exactly what it was. Dashing straight out of the dimly lit galley and into the dark cabin, her eyes took a split second to adjust, to work out exactly what was happening, and when she did, she froze. The woman from 2A was squatting over the sleeping passenger in 6D as if on the toilet. Instinct took over. Kristen lunged forward, grabbed the woman under the arms and pulled her upright. And then, with one swift moment, she yanked up her underwear back into place and steered her towards the front of the cabin. "Madam," she said, somehow keeping her voice calm as she pushed open the washroom door, "the toilet is just here." The woman offered no resistance as Kristen guided her into the toilet. In fact, she barely seemed awake, shuffling forward as though she was sleepwalking, completely unaware of where she was. Kristen pulled the door closed behind her, hoping she would work out what to do once in there. And only then did the full horror of what had almost happened hit her. Or worse, what had actually happened. The passenger in 6D might well have already received a very unwelcome shower. She took a slow breath. She'd check on him next. Gary emerged from the cockpit just as the door closed, Kristen's hand against it, holding it shut. He looked from the door to her and back again, waiting for an explanation. She was trying to pee on 6D's head. Kristen couldn't even dress it up. There was no delicate way of putting it. Gary nodded slowly as he processed the information. "I see," he said eventually, his face cycling through a series of expressions before finally settling on professional neutrality. "And 6D? Could you please check on him for me? I'm not sure how far she got." She glanced at the toilet door. She needed to stay around here in case she came out. Gary nodded, switched on his torch, and disappeared into the cabin. He returned less than a minute later. "Fast asleep," he said. Kristen shook her head in disbelief. How drunk must they have been? Would he even remember in the morning that a lady tried to give him a golden shower at 39,000 feet? By the time the sun began to rise, the night's antics had been discussed and digested by the whole crew. There had been fits of giggles and faces of horror, but now that she'd slept on it, it almost seemed like a distant memory. Kristen kept her head down as she walked up the cabin from the crew rest area. People were beginning to stir, and she could feel them, trying to get her attention, about to ask her for water after they'd woken up drier than the desert. She sympathized. She really did. But if she stopped for one person, it would trigger a domino effect. Before she knew it, she'd be handing out drinks throughout the entire economy cabin before she'd even made it back to business class. No, she thought, ignoring another polite, "Excuse me." She needed a moment for herself first. She needed to use the washroom and put on her lipstick before she was hurled into a full-on, all-singing and dancing breakfast service that was giving her major anxiety right now. She glanced in the galley as she dashed past. It looked like controlled chaos. Trays, crockery and food were everywhere, and somehow she was expected to take orders from and deliver food to an entire aisle of people on 3 hours sleep and after the disaster of the dinner service. In the washroom, she sighed as she straightened her hair in the mirror, looking her reflection in the eye. "You can do it," she said. Taking one last deep breath, she stepped back into the cabin. Around her, passengers emerged from their little cocoons, raising their seats upright and pulling out tray tables in anticipation of breakfast. To Kristen, it felt as though every pair of eyes was following her. She hurried between the galley and the cabin as quickly as she dared. Full English, please. Croissant and fruit salad, white coffee and 1 tea. Slowly, she found her rhythm. Once she knew where everything lived, it wasn't nearly as daunting. Cereals and cold items on one side, dirty crockery on the other. Every trip to the galley made a little more sense than the last. It was really just like working in a restaurant, she realised, as she poured milk onto 2 bowls of Special K, made 2 cups of tea and arranged everything neatly onto a tray for the passengers in 6 and 7A. She balanced the tray effortlessly on one hand, quietly proud of herself. Not bad for someone who'd never worked as a waitress. As she passed 2A, she glanced down. The woman was still fast asleep. A moment later, she looked across at 6D. He hadn't moved either, lying face down with only his head and shoulders visible above the duvet. She'd have to wake them both soon, but she was deliberately leaving them until last. That would give her a few more minutes to decide whether, or not, to mention what had happened during the night. 6A was standing in the aisle, rummaging through the overhead locker, and Kristen waited patiently beside him, balancing the breakfast tray on one hand while he searched for whatever he was looking for. He didn't seem to notice that she was there. And he certainly didn't notice the small black holdall slowly edging its way towards the front of the locker as he moved things around. Kristen froze as it unfolded, watching the small black holdall as it teetered on the edge and then fell in slow motion out of the locker and straight onto her tray. Instinctively, she sidestepped, desperately trying to save the tray, but it was hopeless. The holdall landed squarely on the edge, catapulting the entire breakfast into the air before it came crashing back down on 6D's sleeping head. 2 bowls, 2 teacups and their saucers clattered onto his skull before crashing onto the floor, leaving a trail of cereal flakes, milk and tea running down the side of his face. Kristen let out a gasp and stood rooted to the spot. On the floor, 6D opened his eyes and looked up in confused disbelief. And meanwhile, 6A had jumped back into his seat and his eyes were now firmly fixed on his TV screen, as if he hadn't even noticed what had happened, let alone be the cause of it. I am so sorry, Kristen stammered, crouching down to pick up the broken pieces. I'll just get something to clean this up with. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see her colleagues peeking out the galley, and without even looking, she knew that they were laughing. Perhaps one day, she thought as she picked up the last of the pieces, she'd find this flight funny too. But right now, the whole cabin's eyes were on her. Except for 6A and 2A, of course. If someone had handed her a parachute, she'd have strapped it on and the door opened before you could even say Special K. "2A didn't wake until the seatbelt signs came on for landing, and Kristen had to gently shake her shoulder. The woman opened her eyes and offered a faint smile, but Kristen could tell it was mostly for show. She could almost feel the pounding headache behind her eyes and the nausea churning in her stomach. "Good morning, madam. We'll be landing shortly." Great. Thank you," she replied, fumbling for the button that would return her seat to the upright position. Did you sleep well?
Yeah, thanks.
Kristen smiled and held her gaze for just a fraction longer than was strictly necessary, long enough to see a flicker of uncertainty cross the woman's face. Coffee? She asked. The woman nodded. Water? Another nod. Kristen was sorely tempted to ask, and the toilet? But instead she bit her tongue. She'd already said enough. From the look on the woman's face, she had the distinct feeling that somewhere, buried beneath the fog of alcohol, she knew something had happened, even if she couldn't quite remember what. As the aircraft touched down in Shanghai, Kristen breathed a long sigh of relief. She took her place by the disembarkation door, smiling politely as the passengers began to file past. 6D was one of the first to leave, now dressed in the complimentary business-class pajamas the cabin manager had found for him, after also awarding him a rather generous amount of frequent flyer miles by way of apology. He gave Kristen a look that she could only interpret as, "Please stay away from me, you're a fucking disaster." She couldn't really blame him. As he disappeared down the jet bridge, she noticed him absent-mindedly picking the last few flakes of Special K from his hair. When 2A reached the door, she offered Kristen a small smile. It was accompanied by the same faint frown she'd worn since waking up. The expression of someone who knew they'd probably done something terribly embarrassing, but wasn't quite brave enough to ask what it had been. Kristen smiled back. Some things were better left unsaid. Only after the last passenger had stepped into the terminal did the adrenaline that had carried her through the flight finally disappear, and suddenly she felt unbelievably tired. "I'm so tired," she sighed, changing into her flat shoes and following Gary off the aircraft. That was literally the worst flight of my entire flying career. Gary laughed. "You survived," he said with a grin. "Did I?" Kristen replied. She wasn't convinced. She felt as though she had died, been buried, and then been dug up again. Her feet hurt, her head hurt, her confidence had evaporated, and her dignity had disappeared somewhere over eastern China. Apparently, she thought with a weary shrug, that's what surviving business class looked like. Gary, a step ahead, glanced back over his shoulder. "And the best part," he said, "is that you get to do it all again on the way home." Kristen stopped walking and let that sink in for a second. She looked at the aircraft and then back at Gary. And inside, she died for the second time that day. The Red Eye Podcast is written by Kaylee Kay, narrated and produced by me, Ali Murphy. These stories are based on true events, but certain details, characters, and timelines have been altered to protect the innocent. Visit our website, theredeyepod.com, to subscribe to our newsletter and to find out details on how you can contribute your story for us to turn into an episode. If you enjoyed listening to our stories, please like, subscribe, and review. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Red Eye Podcast. You guys are why we do this. We love the stories that you have, and we love telling you the stories that people share with us. To help us reach more people and get the podcast really out there, we would really appreciate it if you left a review. It just helps our podcast be a little bit more visible. Thank you.